the Secretary of State for Health, Secretary Jeremy Hunt.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to make a statement on the future of South London Healthcare NHS Trust. The NHS exists to provide patients with the highest levels of care and compassion, and it does so in a way that is more equitable than any other country in the world. Comprehensive care, free at the point of need. But to be true to those values, different parts of the NHS need to be financially sustainable. Financial problems left unaddressed become clinical problems, not least because money used to fund deficits cannot be used for patient care. The South London Healthcare NHS Trust is the most financially challenged in the country, with a deficit of £65 million per annum. It currently spends some £60 million a year, or 16% of its annual income, to service 2 PFI contracts signed in 1998. For this and other reasons, repeated local attempts to resolve the financial crisis at the Trust have failed. As a result, the Trust is losing more than £1 million every week. In the 3 years since it was formed in 2009, it has generated a deficit of £153 million, a figure that will rise to more than £200 million by the end of this financial year, a huge amount of money that has to be diverted away from frontline patient care. So after consulting with the Trust, its commissioners and the London Strategic Health Authority, my predecessor as Health Secretary, my right honourable friend, the Leader of the House, instituted the special administration process, which includes a period of intense local engagement. Matthew Kershaw, former Chief Executive of Salisbury NHS Foundation Trust, was appointed as the Trust Special Administrator in July 2012, and I would like to put on record my thanks to him and his team for his exceptionally detailed and thorough work. Mr. Kershaw had the extremely difficult task of finding a clinically and financially sustainable way forward for the South London Healthcare NHS Trust. Reluctantly, he concluded that only by looking beyond the boundaries of the Trust to the wider health community was he able to put forward a viable solution. I support that analysis. I received his recommendations on the 7th of January. 6 of his 7 recommendations were as follows. Firstly, that over the next 3 years, all 3 hospitals within the Trust, Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Woolwich, Queen Mary's in Sidcup and the Princess Royal in Bromley, make the full £74.9 million of efficiencies he has identified. Secondly, that Queen Mary's in Sidcup be transferred to Oxleas NHS Foundation Trust and developed into a hub for the provision of health and social care in Bexley. Thirdly, that all vacant or poorly utilised premises be vacated and sold where possible. Fourthly, that the Department of Health pay the additional annual funds to cover the excess costs of the PFI buildings at the Queen Elizabeth and Princess Royal Hospitals. Fifthly, that the South London Healthcare Trust be dissolved, with each of its hospitals taken over by neighbouring NHS and Foundation trusts. Sixth, to aid implementation, he further recommended that the Department of Health write off the accumulated debt of the Trust so as to not set up the new trusts to fail. That the Department of Health provide additional funds to cover the implementation of his recommendations, and that a programme board be appointed under an independent chair, reporting to Sir David Nicholson as Chief Executive of the NHS Commissioning Board, to ensure the changes are effectively delivered. I've accepted each of these recommendations in full. As a consequence, he also recommended that services be reconfigured beyond the confines of South London NHS Trust across all of South East London. This part of his recommendation included reducing the number of A&E departments across the area from 5 to 4, replacing the A&E department at University Hospital Lewisham with a non-admitting urgent care centre, reducing the number of obstetrician-led maternity units from 5 to 4, downgrading the current obstetrician-led maternity unit at University Hospital Lewisham to a standalone midwife-led birthing centre. Each obstetrician-led maternity unit would also have a midwife-led birthing centre, co-locating paediatric emergency and inpatient services with the 4 A&E units, with paediatric urgent care provided at Lewisham Guy's and Queen Mary's Hospital. And finally, that University Hospital Lewisham should become a centre for non-complex elective procedures, such as hip and knee replacements, to serve the entire population of South East London. The public campaign surrounding services at Lewisham Hospital has highlighted just how important it is to the local community. And I respect and recognise the sense of unfairness that people feel because their hospital has been caught up in the financial problems of its neighbour. However, solving the financial crisis next door is also in the interests of the people of Lewisham, because they too depend on the services currently part of South London Healthcare Trust. Nonetheless, I do understand their very real concerns about how any changes could affect their access to vital health services. These concerns are echoed by Lewisham CCG and many clinicians at Lewisham Hospital. I've had in-depth discussions with the honourable members representing those affected who have reflected those concerns to me. And as a result, I asked the NHS Medical Director, Professor Sir Bruce Keogh, to review the recommendations and to consider three things: whether there was sufficient clinical input into the development of the recommendations, whether there is a strong case the recommendations will lead to improved patient care in the local area, and whether they are underpinned by a clear clinical evidence base, as set out in the third of the four tests for reconfigurations. On the matter of clinical input, a highly experienced clinical advisory group, led by a local GP, Dr. Jane Fryer, and including 8 trust medical directors, 6 clinically qualified CCG chairs, the London Ambulance Service medical director, the local director for trauma, and 3 directors of nursing, supported the trust special administrator. Further scrutiny and challenge was provided by an external clinical panel, which included representatives from the Royal College of Midwives and Obstetrics and Gynaecology. The panel was chaired by Professor Chris Welsh, SHA Medical Director for Midlands and the East of England. Both groups included respected national and local clinicians, built on years of previous work in this area, and held a series of clinical workshops in August and September last year. Sir Bruce was satisfied that there had indeed been sufficient clinical input. On the issue of better care and clinical evidence, the recommendations provide for the adoption for the first time in South East London of the 2012 Pan-London Standards for Acute Care. This is the standard that all 6 local CCGs have said they want to commission for both emergency and maternity care. And these standards define the best available clinical practice and set the bar higher than that provided by most other acute providers in England. Sir Bruce agreed that the adoption of these standards could not be achieved without a reduction in the number of sites delivering acute inpatient care, and such a reduction will enable the necessary concentration of resources and senior clinical staff. A similar approach has already led to significant improvements in stroke, major trauma and cardiovascular disease services throughout London, saving hundreds of lives for both emergency and maternity care. Sir Bruce found no evidence that patients would be put at risk through increased journey times. The whole population of South East London will continue to be within 30 minutes of a blue light transfer to an A&E department, with a typical journey time being on average only 1 minute longer. Accessing consultant-led maternity services will increase journey times on average by 2 to 3 minutes by private or public transport. Sir Bruce concluded, therefore, that there should be no impact on quality of care from the small increase in travel time. On the issue of maternity service, the expert clinical panel advising the TSA was not willing to support the increased risk to patients of having an obstetrician-led unit at Lewisham without intensive care services, as achieving the London-wide clinical standards will only be possible with the consolidation of the number of sites with these facilities. Sir Bruce supports the proposal for this unit to be replaced with a freestanding midwife-led unit at Lewisham Hospital. This will continue to deal with at least 10% of existing activity and potentially up to 60%. And £36 million of additional investment has been earmarked to ensure there is sufficient capacity at other sites. Turning now to the emergency care proposals, Sir Bruce was concerned that the recommendation for a non-admitting urgent care centre at Lewisham may not lead, in all cases, to improved patient care. Whilst those with very serious injury or illness would be better served by a concentration of specialist A&E services, this would not be the case for those patients requiring short, relatively uncomplicated treatments or a temporary period of supervision. To better serve those patients, who would often be frail and elderly and arrive by non-blue light ambulances, Sir Bruce recommends that Lewisham Hospital should retain a smaller A&E service with 24/7 senior emergency medical cover. With these additional clinical safeguards and the impact that this is likely to have on patient and clinician behaviour, Sir Bruce estimates that the new service could continue to see up to 3/4 of those currently attending Lewisham A&E. Allowing Lewisham to retain its A&E would help to reduce the level of increased demand at hospitals with larger A&E services, while an additional £37 million of investment will further expand services at these hospitals for more serious conditions. Sir Bruce advised that patients with those more serious conditions should now be taken to King's, QE, Bromley or St Thomas's, not for financial reasons, but to increase their chances of survival. On the issue of paediatric care, Sir Bruce recognised the high-quality paediatric services at Lewisham and that any replacement would have to offer even better clinical outcomes and patient experience. His opinion is that this is possible, but dependent on very clear protocols for primary ambulance conveyance, a walk-in paediatric urgent care service at Lewisham, and rapid transfer protocols for any sick children who would be better treated elsewhere. He is clear that this will require careful pathway planning and need to be a key focus of implementations. With these caveats, Sir Bruce was content to assert that there is a strong case that the recommendations are likely to lead to improved care for the residents of South East London and that they are underpinned by clear clinical evidence. He believes that overall these proposals as amended could save up to 100 lives every year through higher clinical standards. Yesterday, 30th of January, as no viable alternative plan had been put forward, and in light of Sir Bruce's opinion, I decided to accept the recommendations of the Trust Special Administrator, subject to the amendments suggested by Sir Bruce. It is important to be clear that my acceptance of these recommendations is conditional on Monitor approving the proposals relating to foundation trusts and on my department negotiating an appropriate level of transitional funding with organisations such as King's Partners. Due to the size of the task, there is a significant level of risk associated with achieving the identified savings. I recognise that the additional clinical safeguards I have put in place will marginally increase these financial risks, but on balance I have made the judgment that it is worth it if it means local patients are reassured that they will gain from an additional better service rather than losing their A&E. I believe that the amended proposals meet the 4 tests required for local reconfigurations, and I am therefore content for the process to now proceed to implementation, and I expect the South London Healthcare NHS Trust to be dissolved by no later than the 1st of October 2013. The implementation of these proposals will be challenging and complex. It needs to be planned for carefully. It will not happen overnight. I call on all organisations, hospitals and commissioners to offer their full support during the coming years to achieve the ambition of these proposals for the benefit of the people of South East London, and I commend this statement to the House.
Mr. Andy Burnham.
Mr. Speaker, just when you thought this government's mismanagement of the National Health Service couldn't get any worse, it just has. Let us be clear about what the Secretary of State has just announced today. He has at last accepted recommendations that were agreed by the previous government but then delayed by his predecessor's moratorium, thereby deepening the financial problems of South London NHS Trust. And he has rejected an outrageous proposal that Lewisham Hospital should lose its accident and emergency department, a proposal that never should have been made in the first place, but which has cost over £5 million of precious NHS cash on accountants in the process, enough to give some of the 5,000 nurses they have sacked their jobs back. But he has accepted the principle that a successful local hospital can have its services downgraded to pay for the failures of another trust, and that takes the NHS into new territory. The Secretary of State has just crossed a line and set dangerous precedents, namely that in his new market-driven NHS, finance takes precedence and any hospital is vulnerable to changes, no matter how successful, through backdoor reconfiguration. That success can be punished and failure rewarded, and that a community can see its A&E and maternity services downgraded without proper consultation, without clinical justification. There will be no cheers for this statement in Lewisham, Mr. Speaker, and it will send a chill wind through any community worried about its hospital services. And there is now utter confusion about the government's policy on hospital reconfiguration. In 3 years, they have gone from moratorium to pandemonium. Across the country, half-baked, cost-driven proposals to close A&Es and maternity units are being foisted on local communities without evidence of how they can be done safely and without putting lives at risk. And yet, at the very same time, A&Es everywhere are under severe pressure. Thousands more patients are waiting for more than 4 hours to be seen, and there are queues of ambulances lined up outside. In that context, it is simply not tenable to downgrade any A&E department without first establishing a clear clinical case for how it can be done without compromising patient safety. But that is what they are doing here. They have set up a financially driven process and have thrown together a clinical justification, not independent, but drawn up in his own department, leaving the Secretary of State's so-called 4 tests in tatters. The 4th test, let me remind him, is that any proposal for change must have, quote, demonstrable support from commissioners. So let me quote to the Secretary of State from the chair of the Lewisham Clinical Commissioning Group, Dr. Helen Tattersfield. She has said this: if the TSA proceeds as currently planned, it is my belief that not only will this result in a reduction of quality and provision of health services for Lewisham residents with huge risks to health outcomes, but also the effective end of clinical commissioning in Lewisham. It is clearly the case that the proposals he has just announced will lead to a reduction, in Dr. Tattersfield's words, of quality and provision in Lewisham. That these changes are opposed by the doctors he promised to put in charge of the NHS, and therefore they clearly fail the 4th test that they have set out. Furthermore, I ask him whether he is confident that what he has announced today is legal. We warned him that he was going beyond the powers in the 2009 Act. He said he would commission fresh legal advice. Will he publish it today so there can be a proper debate on the legal position? He mentions PFI, but isn't it the case that the schemes he mentioned were initiated and negotiated under the Major government? And he said he consulted with the Trust, the South London Healthcare Trust. Isn't it a fact that they found out from the media about this process? Mr. Speaker, this will damage fragile trust in the way the NHS manages changes to hospitals. They need to get back to first principles. Will he confirm, learning from this debacle, that in future no proposal to downgrade or close A&E and maternity services will ever get out of the starting blocks if it does not have a proper clinical case to support it? And finally, Mr. Speaker, will he today issue an apology to the people of Lewisham? How on earth are they expected to have confidence in the figures he has announced today from a clinical review thrown together, cobbled together in his department in a matter of days? He has caused huge distress to them, but also he has failed to listen to them. Thousands of people have put their lives on hold to fundraise, to lobby, to campaign. 52,000 names on a petition, 25,000 people on a march. A community that has rallied together to defend their local hospital, led by the fantastic efforts of the local MPs. But more than that, has fought valiantly for every community worried about this government's cavalier approach to our country's most valued institution. A community which has stood up to an out-of-touch government which thinks it can treat some of the more deprived parts of our country with utter disdain. They have achieved something today, but I am certain they will continue the fight. And let me say, Mr. Speaker, they will have our support. Will he confirm today that what he has just announced takes away their right of appeal to the independent reconfiguration panel? And if that is the case, aren't they justified in continuing the fight to stop this government riding roughshod roughshod over the people of Lewisham and South London. In conclusion, what we have seen here today is the first glimpse of the new market-driven NHS they have created, where the money men and not the medics are calling the shots. We have seen another chapter in the unfolding omni-shambles that is this government. This one, sadly, this chapter could be titled the Lewis Shambles. We have seen a scandalous waste of money on a solution that won't be acceptable to people in Lewisham, but is not acceptable to people anywhere. He is asking this House to accept the unacceptable. We won't do it for Lewisham, and we won't do it for anywhere else.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid that the Shadow Health Secretary clearly wrote his response before he read my statement, and I'm afraid listening to him this morning, he has never sounded further away from being the government in waiting that he aspires to be. Let me say this to him now. The apology over what's happening in South London Healthcare Trust needs to come from the Labour Party, because they were the people that failed to resolve this problem over very many years. They were the party that set up 2 PFI deals that have been incredibly dangerous. They were signed in 1998, the 2 PFI deals. They were the party that created a financial situation that means that £1 million every week is being bled from frontline patient care in order to fund a deficit, and that means that 100 lives every year are not being saved that could be saved in Lewisham and the whole of South East London. And what I didn't hear from his statement was any contrition at all that this incredibly difficult problem was something that his government, and indeed he as Health Secretary, had totally failed to resolve. And let me remind him that the legislation that I followed actually came from the Labour Party, who passed it when they were in government. He asked me to confirm that the people of Lewisham have no right of appeal to the IRP after this decision. Well, who was it who stripped the people of Lewisham of that right to appeal? It was him when his government passed this legislation. And, you know, nothing that he said this morning at all has failed to come up with a single alternative proposal to deal with this problem. And if he was being responsible as Shadow Health Secretary, he would have been able to come up with just one proposal. He wasn't able to come up with a single proposal, and he didn't tell the House what any of his ideas were this morning. And let me just say this, when he talks about the pressure on A&E, we'll take no lessons. We met our A&E targets last year, whereas in Wales, where the Labour Party are cutting the NHS budget by 8%, they haven't met their A&E target since 2009. Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid what we've heard today, and I hope we will have a different tone from some of the other contributions, we've heard a very, very disappointing response from the Labour Party. The Shadow Health Minister, who I notice is not on the front bench today, and perhaps this will explain why. She said that Labour would not do what she called the easy politics of opposing every single reconfiguration. Well, what we've heard is the easy politics this morning from a party that, while it was in office, closed at least 12 A&Es. They closed at least 9 maternity units. And he needs to recognise that the responsible thing for a health secretary is to do what will save the most lives, and that's what I've announced this morning.
Bob Neal. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I say to my right honourable friend that my honourable friends, the member for Old Bexley and Sidcup and Bexley Heath and Crayford, are currently on duty in a public bill committee, but wish me to associate their comments with my own question and to congratulate and thank him upon taking a tough but necessary decision to deal with a mess which was not of his making, which was inherited from members opposite. Will he accept too that more care has been taken thanks to the intervention of Sir Bruce Keogh's review, both with an evidence base and consultation, than was taken by the previous government in reduction of services in the accident and emergency at Queen Mary's Sidcup? But can he help me perhaps with the likely time frame to conclude the discussions on transitional funding with King's Partners, which is particularly important for those of us whose constituents are predominantly served by the Princess Royal University Hospital at Farnborough?
Well, let me thank my honourable friend for his very constructive involvement in all the discussions we've been having to resolve this difficult issue, particularly with respect to his own constituents. And he's absolutely right that because, in the end, the thing that matters most are the clinical considerations, I thought it was extremely important to take advice from the NHS Medical Director, Sir Bruce Keogh, and I have taken that advice, and he is absolutely clear that doing this will save lives, and I think that is my biggest responsibility. He is also right to say that the success of these proposals does depend on negotiations with King's partners about the potential merger that they're involved with, and we want to conclude those as quickly as possible, but they are a very important part of this. It is our ambition to proceed as quickly as possible because for the sake of the people of South London, they need certainty about the future provision of their health services, but we do have some difficult negotiations to conclude in order to make that happen.
Dame Joan Ruddock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The only reason that these proposals to close the A&E in Lewisham and downgrade the maternity services have not gone ahead in full is, of course, because of the enormous protests of over 50,000 local people and the almost total opposition of all consultants and the GPs, including the GP commissioning group. Today's proposals now are an absolute sham and a shambles, and they are utterly unacceptable to all of us who represent people in Lewisham. Will he not agree that he should, instead of allowing this rushed TSA process, which is completely unsuitable for the reconfiguration that he now proposes, surely he must allow the GP commissioning group to do the job for which he set them up, which is to lead a consultation process properly to understand what are the clinical needs of local people, whether the merger should go ahead between Lewisham and Woolwich Hospital, and meet the real clinical needs of the local people. And will he also acknowledge that there has been no due diligence done in respect of that proposal, and Lewisham Hospital would need the strongest guarantees that they would not be led into a new unsustainable trust by his proposals?
Well, if I could say to the honourable lady that a sham and a shambles is what I inherited and what I'm dealing with, and it is not what I am bequeathing by what I'm announcing this morning. And with respect to the clinical commissioning group, the GP-led group in Lewisham, of course I understand their opposition to the proposals put forward by the Trust Special Administrator, but they support the principle that complex procedures should be done from fewer sites. And that is a very important procedure. Now, inevitably, when you're reducing the number of sites for complex medical procedures, the people in the areas where those procedures are no longer happening are often opposed to them. And that's what's happening. But they support the principles behind what the Trust Special Administrator said. And I would just say to her, in her final point, that the concern she has that we are setting up a new trust which is not going to be sustainable is precisely why I am taking this extremely difficult decision today. What Lewisham Hospital have proposed is that they should be allowed to work out with Queen Elizabeth Woolwich their own way of dealing with that deficit. That is precisely the problem that happened when South London Healthcare Trust was set up, that trusts which had deficits were put together in a marriage that in the end didn't fail to address those difficult decisions. I think my responsibility to her constituents is to address these issues, to give them certainty about the provision of health service. And if I may say, her constituents already, if they have a stroke or a heart attack, they don't go to Lewisham Hospital, they go to Tommy's or Guy's or other places where those specialist services can be delivered and they get better treatment. We are expanding that principle in what I'm announcing today, and it will save around 100 lives a year, and I think that's something that she should welcome.
Bob Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do actually find it rather strange that a successful hospital is being slashed when other hospitals are being saved, but I'm particularly concerned about some of the figures on which these decisions have been made. And I really require my right honourable friend to justify the financial figures that actually support this case. I personally am very worried about where babies will be born in Lewisham and the loss of the A&E, the full A&E services in Lewisham, and I'm not very happy about it, and clearly I don't support the closure.
Well, there isn't a closure, and let's just talk about maternity deaths, because London has a higher rate of maternity deaths than most other parts of the country. And that is something that no responsible health secretary should not try to tackle. And the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the Royal College of Midwives, all agree that the way to reduce the number of maternal deaths in which London does not score well is to centralise the number of sites that do the more complex births on fewer sites where surgeons can get more experience and can deliver better clinical outcomes. And that is what this proposal is doing, and that is why it will lead to fewer maternal deaths in Lewisham and South East London. It will also mean that for the first time South East London does something that it doesn't do at the moment, which is to meet the London-wide clinical quality standards. And that must be the most important thing for the people of South East London.
Heidi Alexander.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State's announcement today may appear to offer something of a lifeline for Lewisham's A&E, but it is far from the emergency and maternity services that my constituents and the people of South East London deserve. I remain concerned about maternity services in South East London. Between April 2011 and November 2012, maternity services were suspended 37 times in South East London. 4,000 babies a year born at Lewisham. Can the Secretary of State give me some assurance that the money spent on increasing capacity for maternity services at other hospitals will happen in the hospitals where Lewisham mums will actually go?
Well, she is absolutely right that any change like this has to be done extremely carefully, and we are investing an extra £36 million to expand the capacity of neighbouring consultant-led maternity services to make sure that it can cope with that extra demand. But could I urge her to understand the clinical rationale behind what is happening? London has halved its mortality rate from strokes because it reduced the number of hospitals treating people with strokes from 32 to 8. And that means that her constituents in Lewisham now go for their strokes to the Princess Royal and to St Thomas's and to King's. And that is something that has led to fewer deaths in Lewisham and many other places. We need to do the same thing when it comes to high-risk pregnancies. And the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists have made it clear that women, if they have a high-risk pregnancy, would prefer to travel a little bit further if it means they're going to get better clinical outcomes, and that's what this is about.
Simon Hughes.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the thoughtful way in which the Secretary of State has tried to deal with the problem, which is absolutely not of his making. And I appreciate the fact that he has changed the key recommendation which was made to him, and that there will be an A&E continuing at Lewisham, dealing with up to 75% of the work. However, I, like other colleagues, don't therefore understand why, if there's to be an A&E continuing at Lewisham, as I believe there should be, there cannot be continuing maternity care there, because the key is that there should be intensive care provision on the site and maternity care services should be provided. And I haven't heard, if I can say to him honestly, that there is any evidence that the key fourth test, namely the support from GP commissioners, has been passed, and I'd like him to give me an assurance that no plans will go ahead until and unless the GP commissioning body in Lewisham agrees to them.
Well, let me take those 2 points in reverse order. First of all, in terms of the support for GP commissioners, all 6 local clinical commissioning groups support the principles upon which these proposals were developed. That is, to meet the London-wide clinical quality standards that are not being met in South East London at the moment, it is necessary to centralise the provision of more complex services in the way that we've already done successfully for heart attacks and strokes. And that applies as much to complex births and complex pregnancies as it does to strokes and heart attacks. It will now apply for the people of Lewisham to conditions like pneumonia and meningitis, and if someone breaks a hip, and those people will get better clinical care as a result of these changes. And that is the really difficult project of this whole work that the Trust Special Administrator has been doing, which is to try to resolve an unsustainable financial situation whilst at the same time improving clinical care for the people of South East London. And I think in the end we have got a set of proposals that do that.
Dame Tessa Jowl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State will be aware of the dismay with which this statement will be heard across South London, and whatever sort of eloquent argument he advances, what the people of South London will take is that maternity services at Lewisham and the A&E services have been downgraded. I've had the opportunity to look very briefly at the wording of his statement, and I'm alarmed by the degree of risk that Sir Bruce Keogh identifies, particularly in relation to the relocation of the paediatric service, and that the clinical outcomes to which he refers are dependent on extremely difficult interconnections between ambulance services, receiving staff, inpatient beds, all working effectively. He rightly recognises the knock-on effect to other hospitals. The Right Honourable Member for Peckham and Camberwell, my Right Honourable friend, the Member for Streatham, and I, together with all South London MPs, recognise the effect of those knock-on effects. We are very concerned, therefore, at King's College Hospital, which has seen a fourfold increase in cancelled operations since 2009-2010, at the consequences for care of the constituents that we represent, and also concern that the responsibility for the PRU, which King's is prepared to welcome, will be properly and adequately financed.
Well, she talks about the risks that Sir Bruce alludes to in his analysis of the Trust Special Administrator's proposals. And that is precisely why I have not accepted the Trust Special Administrator's proposals in their entirety, and I put in place a whole series of additional safeguards. But I would also say to her that not resolving this issue, which is effectively what the Labour Party are saying, because they haven't put forward any alternative proposals, not resolving these proposals itself carries a very high degree of risk. It means that South London would not meet the London-wide clinical quality standards. It means that we would continue to have £1 million a week diverted from frontline patient care into funding an unsustainable deficit. And that will be bad for her constituents as well as those of neighbouring constituencies. So you do have to look at the whole of the South East London healthcare economy as a whole, but the objective must be to improve the service that people receive, and that's why it's a very difficult balance to get right, but I think we have got the right balance in the proposals that I've outlined this morning.
Mr. Stephen Dorrell.
Does my right honourable friend agree that the very difficult decisions that he's announced to the House this afternoon reflect the application in South London, as we have to apply across the rest of the health service, of a willingness to address difficult issues, but led always by clinical evidence about how we deliver the best possible outcomes for the patients who rely upon this service?
your PFI agreements.
Well, I entirely agree with my right honourable friend, and I think it would be totally irresponsible for me as Health Secretary to fail to take a decision that could save as many lives as I believe this decision will take. And in the end, if we are going to save more lives in A&E, if we're going to reduce the number of maternity deaths that we currently have in London, then it does involve taking difficult decisions. And I think the disappointment for me this morning is that the Labour Party have chosen to jump on an opposition bandwagon rather than actually trying to put forward a proposal of their own, a solution of their own that would deal with the clinical issues that we have in South East London, instead of which they are unfortunately playing to the gallery on this, and I'm afraid that is not what a government in waiting should be doing.
Jim Dowd. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by congratulating the Secretary of State for, in his statement, admitting what was denied from the outset, that this is a reconfiguration, and this indeed is a backdoor reconfiguration. I don't think that I, or my right honourable friend, the member for Deptford, or my honourable friend, the member for Lewisham, can adequately represent the outrage and the anger of the people of Lewisham at the sheer unfairness of this whole proposal. Can I tell him that he was wrong to say that Matthew Kershaw concluded that his review needed to go wider than simply South London Healthcare Trust? He started from that premise and openly said so at a meeting in July in, well, I don't know whether it's still the Secretary of State's office now, but it's certainly his predecessor's office. He openly said that's what he was doing. Is the Secretary of State aware that even the proposal on maternity will mean a double rota being necessary at King's College and at Queen Elizabeth because of the increase taking the number of annual births expected at both units to over 8,000. This will lead to worse services and less choice for patients. The fact that it doesn't have local commissioners' support really doesn't seem to register with the Secretary of State. And can he confirm, can he say whether it really was necessary to spend £5.5 million of taxpayers' money demonstrating that his 4 tests are absolutely meaningless and that the guarantees and undertakings of this Tory Liberal government are worthless?
Well, first of all, let me say to him that this is a reconfiguration, but it's a reconfiguration when the normal processes for reconfigurations are suspended because of legislation that was passed by the government that he supported that was in power up until 2010. And the Trust Special Administrator, Matthew Kershaw, looked extensively at whether there was an option within South London Healthcare Trust that could solve this problem. He said, and he invited expressions of interest from other people who might run the hospitals in that group, and he found that no one was able to come forward with a proposal that could solve the problem within the geographical confines of South London Healthcare Trust. And indeed no one else, not the Labour Party, not any of the people opposed to these changes, have been able to come forward with another proposal that does not have some impact on neighbouring healthcare economies. About choice. Choice is not just about the number of hospitals you go to. Choice is about the number of good hospitals you have a choice of going to. And nowhere in South London at the moment meets the London-wide clinical quality standards. As a result of my decision today, the whole of South East London will meet those standards, and it will in fact be one of the best places in London in terms of the quality of care received for people going into A&E and maternity. And in terms of the cost of this process, £5.5 million, that is the cost of failure. The total failure by the last government to address this issue when they could and bequeath the highest deficit anywhere in the NHS.
Nick Dubois. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State recognises that Lewisham is a victim of an unfair decision as a result of failed PFI and failed finance not of his making. He will also recognise the striking similarities with Chase Farm Hospital, which also is downgraded because of the appalling PFI arrangements put in place at neighbouring hospitals. However, he knows I utterly oppose that decision, but given the present concerns, particularly and arising from and to do with implementation, would he agree to meet with me and a cross-party delegation to look closely at these matters?
Well, first of all, I recognise how hard my honourable friend has campaigned on behalf of his constituents and how deeply they feel about these issues. He knows the decision has been made, but with respect to a safe implementation of that decision, we do want to get it absolutely right, and I'd be more than happy to meet with him to discuss how we can best make sure that happens.
Effort. The Secretary of State inherited a mess. It was created by his Conservative predecessor, who abandoned the picture of health process, led to a betrayal of my constituents over what they were expecting to come out of that process, particularly at Queen Mary's Hospital Sidcup. But when he opposed a picture of health, he held up the closure of the A&E, saying that he would decide on that closure based on what local clinicians said. Now, in this process, it is clear that local clinicians are opposed to the closure of this A&E. So can the Secretary of State say what value does he place now on the local commissioners who are clearly completely opposed to what he is proposing?
Well, let me tell the honourable gentleman that of the 6 local clinical commission groups, 5 support these proposals. One of them is against it, but it accepts the principles behind them, which is to deliver higher quality care. We need to do complex surgery on smaller number of sites, and that will mean that more of his constituents get better care outcomes. And if I could just remind him that if his government had actually resolved this problem when they were in office before 2010, none of us would be having this discussion today.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State has accepted almost all of Matthew Kershaw's recommendations. He will know that the Trust Special Administrator recommended a very substantial investment package to support the changes that he was recommending, including 161 million of capital funding and 55 million of transitional funding over 3 years. The Secretary of State in his statement referred to just 36 million of capital spending for maternity and 37 million, if I got the figures right, for A&E. That is 73 million less than Mr. Kershaw's recommendation, and there was no reference in his statement to the transition funding of 55 million. Will he confirm whether Mr. Kershaw's recommendations for that funding have been accepted?
We accept that very detailed analysis was used by Matthew Kershaw to come up with those numbers. We will look at them very carefully, but we also need to have sensitive negotiations with the new partners who are going to be part of making this solution happen before the final numbers are agreed on.
Theresa Pearce.
When modelling need going forward, what account did the Administrator or the Secretary of State take of the fact that there will be an increased health need due to increases in child poverty and homelessness in my constituency that's predicted by every expert? Also, a large part of the efficiency proposals are reliant on keeping elderly vulnerable people out of hospital and being cared for in the community. But with local authority budget cuts, and in some of the private companies delivering those services in Bexley, in my area, are currently slashing the wages and conditions of staff. How does he think that this service will be improved? And will he urgently review those services to elderly people to make sure that they stack up with the proposals that he's outlined today? And also, this morning, the Secretary of State has said a number of times that these plans will save lives. I sincerely hope he is right. But if time shows that he is not right, will he resign?
Well, what a minister does in these situations, and I'm sure that her party was exactly the same when they were in power, is on an issue like that, take very, very seriously the medical advice that they are given. And it's that medical advice that says that the way forward that I'm deciding and announcing this morning will save 100 lives. It's on the basis of that medical advice that I'm taking this decision, and I don't think that she would do any differently in my shoes. With respect to changes in child poverty, changes in demography are taken into account in the modelling that's used, but the overriding priority has been to improve clinical services, and that will make the biggest difference to the most socially disadvantaged people, including the frail elderly, who, I agree with her, are often the least well served by the current structures we have in the NHS and the silos between what local authorities do and what the NHS does. And in government, along with my ministerial colleagues, we're doing a lot of work at the moment to break down those barriers, to make sure that we can offer a more integrated service to the frail elderly and avoid some of the problems that she talks about.
Kate Hoey.
Thank you. Surely the Secretary of State understands, even if Sir Bruce Keogh doesn't seem to understand, the huge effects that are going to be of downgrading the maternity units at Lewisham, particularly for King's and St Thomas's, which is absolutely full to the seams and just will not be able to cater very easily for the increased numbers of women. What exactly is he offering hospitals like mine in terms of finance? And will he now lay it down quite clearly that the kind of merger of King's College Hospital, St Thomas's and Guy's and the Mental Health Trust is not the way forward when it has been brought from the top by those same experts who get it wrong so often and has had absolutely no involvement from local people? Will he say now that in view of all the disruption that's going on, it is absolute nonsense for millions of pounds to be spent on consultants and business plans to bring together a huge organisation that is not going to be in the interests of local people?
Yeah. Well, with respect to the merger, could I just gently point out to her that if she's against people deciding things from the top down, then I want to follow that advice. And I think that it is for local trusts to negotiate these things, and they must do so on the basis of what is in the clinical interests of the population they serve. But I'm not going to be a Secretary of State who steps in and stops these things happening unless it amounts to a reconfiguration, in which case there are proper procedures in place that mean that there has to be proper democratic support for any changes that happen. With respect to the effect of the changes in maternity provision in Lewisham, we have allocated £36 million to expanding the capacity at the other hospitals that will take on more of the complex and high-risk births as a result of these proposals. And we work very closely with those trusts to make sure that we have that capacity in place. And I would agree with her that it's extremely important that that work is done in a meticulous way to make sure that we do indeed get the better clinical outcomes that we want to get as a result of what I'm announcing today.
Mr. Kevin Barron.
I sat on the Health and Social Care Bill Committee, which principle in that bill that became an act last year was that clinicians will be in charge. And I'd like to ask the Secretary of State, on the basis that the lead clinical commissioner has said that this downgrading would pose a huge risk to health outcomes in Lewisham, how does that square with the act that they got through here last year?
Well, clinicians and commissioners have been very closely involved, as he will know from reading my statement. This affects the broader South East London area, which in fact covers 6 clinical commissioning group areas, and of those 6, 5 support these proposals. 1 does not, but it supports the principles behind them, which is that for more complex procedures they need to be done on fewer sites. We've also had the benefit of the clinical input of senior people like Sir Bruce Keogh, of many of the Royal Colleges who've been involved in the external clinical advisory group that had a very significant input into these proposals. So one of the questions I asked Sir Bruce was, has there been sufficient clinical input? And his conclusion was, yes, there had been.
Order. Point of order.